Nice. So I had Kyle Summons again. So he's currently at the Arizona Cardinals. So Kyle, can you like introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm one of the assistant strength coaches on staff and the coordinator of sports science at the Arizona Cardinals. I've held this role for this is going on my third season, so it's been fun. I came from college. My backstory is University of Washington for 7 years under Chris Peterson, Jimmy Lake. Before that, University of Nevada for 5 years, where I actually worked with men's basketball. I was in charge of them, women's soccer, track and field, and then I helped as an assistant with football. Before that, I played college football at University of Nevada. So that's kind of the backstory, and yeah, leave it at that.
Nice, nice. I know we talked a little bit before, and we talked a little bit on the phone about like return to play, but and I feel like at this point, like you kind of are known as like the return play guy. So what got you into like the return to play?
Yeah, I think that's a really good story. I think I got to go back to essentially when I was playing college football. And when I was playing college football, I had really bad patellar tendonitis in both knees, bilateral. And this is back in the day where I say back in the day, this is 2005, six, and seven. Really, it was just take anti-inflammatories, ice, and I just kept playing. What I realized and anecdotally is the heavier resistance made my knees feel a little bit better. But at the end of the day, I definitely had a strategy around loading my quads just because my knees were hurting. And so I'd back squat, no problem, but it probably looked more of like a hip hinge than it did a more vertical torso. So played, I was done, became a strength coach, and then still had tendonitis, and I just did more or less like aesthetic training, which we've kind of talked. And I think the States is more known for aesthetic training, and so looking at cross sectional area and just looking a certain way. And so I kind of trained that way. And then lo and behold, I was playing basketball when I was in charge of men's basketball, and went up for a layup, ruptured my patellar tendon, and then 11 months later after that, I ruptured the other one. Just doing a drill with one of our players, McFadden knees. And so why I'm saying that is because that's kind of the story of where it started. Because I went to the surgeon both times, same surgeon, and just asked him like, why did this happen? And he kind of looked at me and was like, well, you're 22 and 23 years old. Usually we see this in 50-year-olds. And so it kind of like made me think, and I've always thought about that. But lo and behold, 17 years later, now I'm in the NFL and I've had time with injured athletes. I was hurt, reconstructive knee surgery. And so I've never really been shy of working with injured athletes. I just haven't known that much. And I think a lot of times we are very resistant or hesitant to work with injured athletes. Um, but luckily, when I was at Nevada, I got my feet wet with some of our medical people and worked a little more with return to play there. I still wasn't doing a ton. And then went up to the University of Washington. Um, I was an assistant strength coach and I did work with certain subgroups. But then as I was going through my time there, I became director of sports science and became more in charge of return to play with our medical people. And that's where I really kind of got more interested in it. And that's where I worked with all kinds of injuries, torn ACLs, torn pecs, torn triceps. Um, and so the Achilles is kind of where everything kind of really like hit a point. And then I came down University or Arizona Cardinals, and I've worked with some injured guys here as well. But it's taken me a long time, 17 years of trying to refine my craft, and I still haven't probably refined it as much as I'd like to, but it's ever evolving, and that's kind of where I am today. And I think injured athletes or athletes that are banged up, I get more excited about than anything, just because I like challenges. And I think with injured athletes, you have to be a little more diligent. And you have to have a true process, and you can't really screw it up because your margin of error is a lot less.
Nice, nice. So, um, I know we kind of talk about the same topic like a year earlier, like last year, and
Yeah.
you kind of share the same story at Pacey Performance podcast, which is like really good. So, the reason I still want to invite you to talk about, I know the same topics, because they are, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are more and more like Achilles tendon rupture, right? And like in every
Yeah,
sport.
yeah. I think what's happening, I think these strains and these sprains are becoming ruptures. And so the severity of injuries is increasing as opposed to having a ton of just hamstring strains, grade one, grade two. We're actually having ruptures of um, hamstring tendons, whether it's an avulsion of the pelvic bone or not, or it's distal. But we're having a lot more ruptures. We're having more ruptures of definitely Achilles tendon, I feel like, and just the high level sports in general. And ACLs are kind of a moot point as well. Like they're not really going down. I think total a little bit, but at the end of the day, I think it's the positions that we have to pay attention to are the ones that have higher entry velocities. And so you're looking at your big skill positions where they have higher speeds, they got a decel. Um, whereas I think in certain areas the ACLs are going down, but we have to look within the subgroups.
So, um, so I know Adam published like recently just published a paper about Achilles tendon rupture and the
Mhm.
prior injury to that. So, um, this is probably a dumb one, but like any chance since like we got all those like technology, people are chasing peak power, the speed, like the player are getting faster and faster. Like, are we able to like get our athlete like stronger at those positions since like fall step are probably the main injury mechanism in Achilles tendon rupture?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because in the year 2025, we are still seeing these injuries. And we have the most technology, and we have crazy amounts of research taking place still, and they're still happening. And so, I think where I've gone a lot with my training is trying to understand connective tissue, but also understanding the interplay between connective tissue and muscle fibers and how they work together and help each other. And we can't dip the scale one way or the other. We can't have too stiff of an athlete, and we can't have too much of a muscle athlete. I think at the end of the day, we have to balance this out. And so, yeah, getting these people stronger in these positions for sure. But I think too, we have to also pay attention to how athletes are moving. And I think that's where the kinematics really come into play. I'm not saying those are going to take precedence, but it's the kinetics and kinematics together, the inner working of that. And it really just comes back to sound principles and making sure that, the feet and ankle work together. Um, so, that's the big toe, which is super important. Make sure you're flexing extension, but also too, getting stiffness in the ankle just through the soleus and gastroc. But it is that rapid, so-called false step where it's a accel decel position that goes into dorsiflexion with knee extension and also hip extension. So really, you just get max strain down the whole posterior chain and then just rips the Achilles tendon. But I think I've asked some really smart people these questions, researchers, is can we get too stiff? And I think the answer is always going to be, yeah, if you get way too stiff by doing higher velocity movements and joints, it is going to have a diminishing returns on some level. You're going to have a strain or a rupture within the muscle at some point. Um, so it's just a balancing act.
Nice, nice. So, and I've been like reaching out to people, talking to like no matter it's like physical therapist or strength coach or like physicians about like uh these injuries. And what I find which is really interesting is like you can find a lot of physical therapists or like strength coaches that are really good at return play from ACL. But when it comes to like Achilles tendon rupture, there's actually a lot of like people or like strength coaches, PT, they can very confidently say that they know what they're doing. Why do you think that is?
Oh man, I don't know the answer to that one. I think at the end of the day, the amount of ACLs that have taken place over the years. So I think just trial and error, and I think a lot of people have done research on um, repaired ACLs, and they're still doing research. But at the end of the day, these Achilles, I wouldn't say they're a newer thing. They've always been around, but at the end of the day, the sheer volume of them hasn't been like an ACL. And so I think the amount, sheer numbers, I think just the amount of people having a hack at recovering Achilles ruptures is a lot less. But also, too, I think if you look at the research at elite level athletes across all sports, they're saying the recovery timeline is 9 to 18 months. It's a pretty big window. But 60% of those athletes, yeah, they come back, it's just at a reduced rate. So that means 40% of the people are coming back within that time frame and or exceeding where they were previously. That's important to pay attention to. So I think, yeah, athletes are coming back, but at what rate and at what capacity than their previous um, capacities. It's really important as an anchor. And when we went through those Achilles ruptures, that is all we were trying to do. We weren't gunning for times. Our timeline was just infinity. It was more based around function and capacity. And these athletes, the way we trained them was more single joint training to start. You're getting the tissue to do its job. Once the tissue and connective tissue does its job, it can now go across multiple joints. So you're going from intramuscular to intermuscular coordination. I think that's really important to understand is a lot of times we fall in love with the multiple joint movements. I'm not saying they're bad, but I think we're kind of going back in time now. The single joint machine based movements are beneficial on some level. It's just we have to know when to plug them in.
Yeah. It's like years ago, I think I forgot like how many years ago, but like people want like there's actually a lot of coaches say we need to do more and more like multi-joint movement, like squat, deadlift, whatever. But like now, like I think the past 2 years, like you, Chris Chase at Memphis Grizzly, Adam, they're all like using more and more like single joint movement into like
Yep.
their training.
Yep. I think the way to look at it is you're adding a constraint to your environment. In a sense, if I'm doing leg extensions, I have to extend my knee a certain way to move that lever. And so I think that's really important to understand is you can use constraints as your benefit. Doesn't mean you can't go and do multi-joint later, you can. And when you do, you're going to be supercharged. So what happens is when those muscles are required to activate, all of them are going together at one time, and you're going to have a ton of force very rapidly. And so a lot of the guys that go through this system, the best thing they say is, "Wow, I feel connected," or "It feels like I'm supercharged," or "Feels like our afterburners on." Like those are all like positive adaptations. And so I think we can't live in these camps anymore, where it's like, are you Olympic based? Are you multi joint based? Or are you machine based, high intensity based? Like, we need to understand the principles of why we're giving these stressors to the athletes and what changes are we looking for in tissue adaptation. We can get that through machines for sure. And then we can go to multi joint later. That's fine. So I think I've learned over 17 years, don't live in a camp, understand principles, and then you can apply anything.
Nice, nice, nice. All right. So, talk to me about like the return to play process for a Achilles tendon rupture. Like how fast would you load those guys?
I think kind of going back over the past few presentations I've given recently is we have to kind of pull apart load. What is load? I think load is understanding tissue capacity. So that could be holding literally body weight isometric all the way up to something that's 185 pounds. And so what we have to understand is can the athlete one fire the muscles intramuscularly? So can I actually activate my gastroc in plantar flexion? Yes or no? And if I can't, how am I supposed to do it dynamically? And so these are just kind of simple questions. And so it was me and my assistant at the time, Aaron, who's brilliant mind as well, way smarter than I am. But at the end of the day, we got on a board and just started like mapping stuff out and started reading. What we realized was, I think early on, we can add load through duration. And so that's just sitting an athlete down on a bench that's supporting themselves and then just going into actual ankle plantar flexion. And can they get into end range to hold that for 30 seconds? and just watch and see what happens. You start getting force tremors, and if they can't control that, it's telling you something. There's a mismatch between the nervous system and actually the contractile property of that muscle. And so the brain isn't used to that. And so what we're doing is we're lengthening out impulse over time to really cause change. And so once they can do that for 30 seconds and do rounds of it, that's Keith Barr's protocol. That is going to give you a really good foundation. And so really early on, our medical staff at 2 weeks allowed us to start doing that, where we would support them, the injured limb on a bench. So they weren't self-supporting themselves standing up. And so we're altering gravity and you're going to plantar flexion and holding. And can they actually recruit their gastroc with knee extension? Because we know the gastroc is biarticular, it goes behind the knee joint. And so when you go into knee extension, you go into plantar flexion, you're getting max strain of the gastroc. And we've known, looking at research, our ankles are the weakest there. That's when usually your ankle sprains happen is end range plantar flexion. So we've kind of re-engineered it. And so it's not sexy, Eric. Like we did that for every time they stepped foot in the weight room. And then probably around 2 weeks after that, we started doing more so-called soleus work, where it was they would turn sitting on a bench and they were out of a boot then, and they would just put their feet on the ground and then just try and get into big toe extension to do a heel raise to get their soleus to work. I think you'll realize like it sounds very boring and maniacal work, but it was the probably most fruitful work. And it was them trying to really truly activate those muscles. I think we lose sight of that sometimes, and we want to just chase these shiny objects, jump, cut, dunk, whatever it might be. But if you can lay down that foundation, the other stuff is going to be easy down the road. And so we did that for probably 6 to 8 weeks. But in that meantime, we were also using a leg extension and leg curl machine to still train their hamstrings and their quads because they were non-weight bearing. They could not support themselves with load actually. And so this is where machines really opened my eyes. I was like, holy smokes. We would do ISOs, leg extension, so full extension. We'd do 90 degrees. We'd flip them over. And it was one of the best machines because it was a leg extension and a leg curl. So we could manipulate the bench, lie them down, go into hamstring curl. And looking at some of Matt Jordan's work off the ACL injuries, we know deep flexion, you're not great at that. Let's get him strong there. Let's get him strong at 90. Let's get him strong at 130, longer lever. And that was their way to train their lower half until they were out of the boot. And so I think a lot of the times we view methods are the most important, but we're using those methods to get the nervous system to do certain things to activate tissue.
Nice, nice. So like you partial weight bearing for like pretty early on. You said you started at 2 weeks after
Yeah.
the surgery.
Yep.
So at one point they can like just walk normally without the boot.
They started walking out of a boot with the medical people, and the medical people took the boot away for good right around, I got to look it back at the notes, but it's right around 7 weeks. Um, and by then they had a little bit of a limp, but it was more so because I think they were in a boot for so long and altered their gait, not in a negative way. It's just we need to know the ramifications behind that. And so when they took the boot off, they were a lot further along than if we weren't doing anything when the boot was on because they started, you get atrophy right away, 3 to 5 days after surgery, like you're having this connective tissue degradation essentially where the connective tissue is changing and you're getting a lot more scarring, let's call it, to the disarranged fibers, the collagen. And so we got to realign those. That's tensile loading. So long story short, right around 7 weeks, 6 to 7 weeks, they were out of the boot, and we had them doing just like toe walks, split squat holds. Beautiful. That was probably the biggest bang for our buck. Holding kettlebells, get into a 90-degree knee position, and we would manipulate their height and just get them down into it. And the Achilles side that was surgically repaired, it's a way to train big toe extension.
Hmm.
And so the best way to think about all this, Eric, is we didn't do any kind of joint movement of the ankle for a long freaking time. And we made sure it was robust enough, the tissue, so the connective tissue and the muscle tissue, to do its job. So once you start pulling on those bones, it can actually do it. Um, and that's looking at a review that Dustin Ranchik did, looking at all kinds of isometrics of different joints. But once you start looking at the research, it kind of makes you realize like, whoa, we could probably start loading injured athletes sooner, as long as the medical people are okay with it. Um, and there's ways to do it in a very safe manner.
So I guess my following question is like after like they leave the boot and able to
Yep,
walk, at one point would you guys like introduce like maybe basic sprint drills like A skip, B skip, or like even like
it's a good question.
dribbling?
So I think a lot of these people are automatically going to go to like dribbling. So we went against conventional wisdom. What we do, we had a 1080. And so we trained them in the weight room a certain way. And then once they were right around 2.5 months post surgery, we used a 1080 and we started at 15 kilos and just start marching against load. And then we started going higher and higher. Within 2 days, they were going from 15 kilos to 30 kilos and they're going 10 yards. And so that was a way for us to teach them how to, one, run a certain way or accelerate. So what you're doing is you're slowing down them speeds. So when you tell them something, they can actually feel those things. But also, two, the way we trained them for the 2.5 months prior allowed us to do that. The tissue is ready. And I think that's where a lot of these mismatches happen is the timelines are at 2.5, 3 months, but their capacities to do those things are a lot lower. And so there's a huge mismatch where in reality, that 2.5 months, their capacity in those actual gastroc and soleus and Achilles was beyond what they were doing. So it allowed them to do things. And so I'll be honest, we did 2 days of that. Those athletes came back day three and said, "Hey, Kyle, can we keep doing this?" I said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "This 1080 against heavy resistance makes my Achilles feel better." So I got videos of them actually accelerating against 30 kilos at 2.5 months and some change. And they're hitting 4 meters per second and 10 yards at 30 kilos post
Mm,
AC or post Achilles.
that's pretty awesome.
So why I'm saying this is because the timelines weren't time based; it was just capacity based. And I think that a lot of people are going to say that's dangerous, but it's only dangerous if the tissue in the brain isn't ready for it.
Mm. So at one point, sorry, at what point, uh, they're able to go full speed, like just acceleration?
3 months they were running full speed against load,
Oh shit, that's fast.
and this is a 270-pound athlete that was a rush end, and then the other one was a 240-pound middle linebacker.
Wow,
And
that's
so
pretty awesome.
it we didn't tell them to do that, and I'll put that in there. We did not tell them to run. We were having them march and doing like almost like a power march, and they literally just took off and ran. And me and my assistant Aaron kind of like our heart like dropped, but we're like, this is showing the athletes ready for it. The athletes know better than we do. And I think a lot of the times as practitioners, we restrict them too much. When in reality, we have to pay attention with our eyes and listen to the athlete and just see like what are these athletes able to do? And if we're training the right way, they'll be able to do stuff. They'll show us.
Hmm. So, uh, I guess one of the things that I'm like super curious about is like nowadays when it comes to Achilles tendon return to play,
Yeah.
probably most of the guys or like most of the strength coaches would probably use isometric, right?
Yep.
So, and but the thing about like the foot and ankles, like some like when probably sprinting or change direction, you still want some mobility at the let's say subtalar joint or calcaneus. So uh at what point would you like reintroduce those stuff?
Mobility.
Yep.
So we used essentially ISOs and very heavy, slow movement as our mobility. And so that's a way we can stretch the tissue and make change in the tissue. And this is coming off another researcher that I've become friends with and have chatted with. In a sense, we need to look and see concentric versus eccentric actions and what is happening to the fascicles and what is happening in the tension angle. We can make change in the fascicles through heavy eccentric work, and we know that. But I think we need to realize there's a step before that. And so we know joint speeds will change how tissue works. And so if we go too fast too soon, it can cause issues. And so there's a progression that we started using that was heavy, slow movement to heavy, slow-ish movement to very fast movement. And so there's a gradient approach, and this is essentially the framework that we put together. And why it's done so well is because it's looking at just one biomechanics, but it's also looking at the nervous system. But its premise is tissue mechanics. How does tissue work with heavy, slow stuff versus light, fast stuff? And so to answer your question is when you do plantar flexion with knee extension, that's still working on mobility. And then when you go into actual heel drop or a neutral heel with more knee over toes, you're getting more compression of the Achilles tendon. That's going to come down the pipeline at some time. We just can't do it too early because compression causes a lot of issues. And so what we realized is we did start doing that later in their progression of return to play. And it was beautiful. It cleared up a lot of things for us. But I think at the end of the day, tissue, you need to clean up some tissue things first, especially after surgery. And that's activation of the muscle, but also to the collagen.
Hmm. So, uh, it's a it's an accelerated process. So, no, I
People get
love it.
nervous already.
I love it. I love it. But here's the thing. How do you communicate with, I know I asked this before, but still, how
Yeah.
do you communicate with the medical staff since it's the process is probably a lot different than what they used to do?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because there was some hesitation when these guys were starting to do things a certain way. And I think it's because um, we view things dangerous as opposed to are they prepared for it? So it's just are the athletes prepared for this? Yes or no? And if they're not, then yeah, it can be dangerous because you're exposing them to risk. Or if the tissue or the athlete's ready for it, is it dangerous? No, we're hedging risk. And so what we started doing is just having the medical people just watch. And yeah, there's some times we're like, okay, maybe this is too much too early. So we had to back off for a little bit. But at the end of the day, it was a communication. And we communicated things. We talked to them, got their take on it, got our take on it. And I think we're always going to side on caution. But is that what's best for the athlete? I don't know.
So what are those conversations like? Are they like pretty strict on some certain things and you have to like fight for fight for the athlete to do like ISOs?
Yeah. I think what we made hay with early on was them allowing us to take them out of the boot and do just joint isometrics, not walking around, just on a bench supporting themselves. And so they're taking their surgical limb out of weight bearing, and they're just trying to activate a limb. I think that's really important to understand. And then what we started using was the 1080 as our best friend and showing them, hey, actually, the 1080 can get force left and right limbs as they're going through locomotion. And so that would we could show them because we didn't have force plates. And so we could show them that. But also we use the Nord board in a prone ISO position, long liver, to interview the nervous system to see, okay, right versus left limbs, how far off are we from a neural drive component? I mean, shoot, early on it was a giant imbalance, 35%. And we got it down below 10. And so I think a lot of the times, this kind of goes back to me saying it again, is we chase methods when in reality we should understand principles and then you start applying these methods to chase the goal of what you want. And so I think we can change tissue, we can change neural drive components, we can change the nervous system, all how you do certain exercises, but how you manipulate the actual contraction types, and that's constraints. And I think we need to add constraints more in training environments.
Nice, nice. So in like this conversation, you mentioned a lot of time like tissue adaptation or like tissue capacity,
Yeah.
which I feel like people are not talking about these two terms enough. Like we talk about like peak power, peak force, eccentric,
Yeah. Yep.
whatever.
Mhm.
So, uh, does that mean like even if it's not injured athlete, you still introduce these like tissue capacity or like t
Yep.
into their like training? And how do you do that?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So I think a lot of the times people are going to coin me as a rehab guy. But I think the reason I've gone that path is because I've worked with some pretty beat up individuals and they've had great success. And so I think if you can train an injured athlete, you can train a healthy athlete. Now, I don't know what a healthy athlete is in today's world because everybody's had a strain, sprain, or rupture on some level. And so working with these so-called deemed healthy athletes, if you throw EMG on them, have them do certain things in a forced task, you'll probably see some imbalances. And so what these athletes are really good at is they're really good at getting around certain issues that they've had. They know how to get around these issues to achieve a task. And that's why probably these athletes keep falling apart is because we see them do a task, dunk a basketball. We're like, well, they can dunk. Like, what do you mean they're healthy? Well, no, unfortunately, you're actually overloading tissue probably you don't know. And so adding these guardrails, I call them, onto these athletes to really truly understand, cool, can you activate your quads in different ranges of motion with different hip positions? Yes or no? Can you do it with your hamstrings? Yes or no? It's simple questions. And if we can't do it in a controlled environment with no dynamic movement, how are we supposed to do it with dynamic movement? And I keep asking that question. And as speed picks up, the muscle forces change and goes more to connective tissue. And so a lot of basketball players, yeah, they use their connective tissue to do things very well. But when they actually have to use their muscle tissue to do things, which helps with higher speed movements to hold on to the tendon so the tendon can move to do its job. Why wouldn't you want that? And so I think at the end of the day, I call it supercharging the athlete. And we're using these constraints to get the athlete to move a certain way. So when you take those constraints off, go from single joint machine methods to say a trap bar jump or Olympic movement, you're going to have a lot more efficiency. It's neural efficiency, but it's also mechanical efficiency. And so I think it takes a different lens to look through. And I think that's where return to play has helped me, where it's like these athletes they're screwed up. They can't weight bear. How are we going to train them? And so when they are weight bearing, it all comes together. It's like a symphony and things just take off. Um, I'll be honest, my assistant and I at the time had stacks of research, stacks and stacks and stacks, and we didn't stop reading. I'm still reading pertaining to this stuff. And I think there's certain avenues. We always want to chase peak power. Those are byproducts, though.
I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it when you mention that those are byproduct.
That's the end game. That's the byproduct of everything working together. That's you going to a concert or a symphony and listening to the music, man. Like that's icing on the cake. That's the last layer. And if you didn't skip steps along the way and you did things properly through all the joints, no problem.
Nice, nice, nice. So, um, since we're talking about like tissue capacity, so how do you like your I know you kind of already mentioned that how would you do that, but would is it like microdosing into like each strength training session or like you have a day that they have to specifically do like all these ISO or all these like tissue capacity work?
Yeah, I think it's just taking um, a joint approach. It's not a joint by joint approach, but it's just looking at a joint, which is a segment. And so we know joints have to flex and extend. Some have to go into abduction, adduction. Some need to go into internal external rotation. So some have more degrees of freedom. But at the end of the day, if we train those and make those part of the training session, those other multi-joint movements they're going to do are going to be better on some level because you're able to tap into those muscle fibers and you're making it more mechanical efficient. So the way that we would frame it is very early on, you're going through something for the ankle, the knee, and the hip potentially of an isometric. And day one and day two, those isometrics are going to look different. And you're just trying to add tools to the toolbox of the nervous system, more variability, as people call it. So you can tap into that. And so the ISOs can be used as a warm up, but also as part of the lift to supercharge things. If it's in the lift, the ISOs are going to be a little bit heavier. And now, when I mention ISOs, it's mainly yielding versus overcoming. which those have different neural implications, but also different implications on tissue. And so peeling those apart and understanding how they do that is very important. But yeah, if you see warm-ups, there's gonna be ISOs layered in, plus in the workout as well. And people are asking all the time, aren't you creating fatigue? No. Why are guys, if they're going through that, jumping higher than they ever jumped in their life? Why are guys running faster than they ever ran in their life?
Nice, nice. All right. I feel like I need to ask this. All right. So you mentioned that you use yielding more than overcoming. Why is
Mm,
that?
mm. Okay. I think what's happened with overcoming, not in a bad way, I talk to Buddy all the time about this, is overcoming, you can stand on force plates and do what? Pull independence and see massive forces. But if we look at Dr. Gerard McMahon, like he's talked a lot about this. We don't know where those forces are going. And so in our mind, we're thinking, oh, cool, we're actually overloading tissue. I don't know if we are. And we can only really truly see that through other mechanisms. But, anyways, at the end of the day, overcoming, it really overloads the agonist. And there's a good review that's in preprint right now. Agonist muscles, overcoming. Agonist, antagonist, synergistic muscles, yielding. And so if we're really trying to go after like one subset of muscles, the stronger ones, yeah, do overcoming. But at the end of the day, that's going to make you really freaking stiff. Not a bad way. We just have to know the ramifications. Whereas yielding, you can add a little more compliance, and people think it's more eccentric driven. What you're doing is you're actually causing those muscle fibers, myosin and actin, to start shortening, which start pulling on the tendons. And so, if we look at some of the work that's been done, you can actually add some stiffness in your tendons by doing yielding isos, as long as it's heavy enough. And so, for me, working with these athletes, I've realized that overcoming just one, they feel better, or sorry, yielding makes them feel better. That makes them a little more able to get in positions, but also too looking at how it works neurally. All those three things I mentioned, agonist, antagonist, synergistic, but also different parts of the brain versus overcoming. I view them highly beneficial.
Nice. So, uh, I'm gonna jump out the whole return to play topic, and I want to ask you like, you work at college football level before, now you're
Yeah.
at pro setting, and you also work with college basketball before, and now you like are known like probably the return to play guy. So, like, what are your like next, like maybe next topic, next thing you want to know or you want to learn or you want to dive into?
Man,
Yeah,
that's a
since
good
you also
question.
work with Buddy Morris, like legend.
Yeah, I work with him daily. He's amazing. We have a really good staff in general. Just Buddy, Evan, Shay, Everett, Jason. Like we have a really good staff. But to learn more about, I think we're always learning. And so the way I kind of learn is like in blocks. And so like I go down a path where it's like a topic and I find out who's like the best researcher or applied practitioner in that area. And I just start trying to read their work. And so I think my next rabbit hole is going down more eccentrics, looking at the neural implications of eccentric, which is very different than concentric, looking at the tissue adaptation of different eccentric work, EQI, submax, supermax, um, and then getting into sarcomerogenesis. Can we add sarcomeres in cereal? Some people say yes, some people say no. Um, so I think just learning more about eccentrics in general, so brain, tissue, neural drive, etc.
Man, that's like a whole PhD thing.
It's just kind of how I learn, and like maybe I will try and get a PhD at some point. I don't know. Like I just like learning, and I think I want to learn to make sure it's doing right by the athlete. That's why.
Nice, nice. All right. Last question before I let it go. Uh, 17 years in this industry. And like I know like you work at different settings and pro settings or like D1 college setting are crazy. So any advice for those like young coaches who want to pursue their dream, they want to work at pro setting, they want to work at maybe college.
Yeah, I think the best advice I can give somebody, don't chase logos, don't chase prestige. I think I've had this conversation with people in the past. The lowest levels are sometimes the best because you get the most responsibilities. Whereas at these bigger levels or these higher levels, yeah, you might say you worked at, say, NBA team early on or a very high, like prestigious college at some level early on, but what are you really doing day in and day out? That's what's going to really like sharpen your tools. And so looking at my path, like I can just give advice on that. And if I didn't work at University of Nevada for 5 years and do what I did there, I don't know if I'd be where I'm at today. And so we had a really good staff down there as well. A lot of those guys I worked with went on to be head guys. Um, but we had like a think tank every day around some coffee. Um, and we were able to actually truly train athletes and try things. And I think that's another thing I can tell people too, is they always ask me like, well, how did you get those Achilles guys back so fast? It wasn't just me, it was a collection of people to begin with, but then too, like Aaron and myself weren't afraid to try things. And how did we hedge our bets? Read research and see how it was done and start applying it. Um, so I think start at low levels and don't be afraid to try things. And I think a lot of times people think they're going to go backwards if they go, say, from MBA, take it out of the, so let's say like NBA, NFL, high college, if they're like an intern or low level assistant and they go be a head guy at a smaller school, they think that's a step backwards. I don't think it is. We got to look at it as what are the responsibilities? Because people hire you based off your responsibilities that you've been doing or the frameworks you've built to show results. And if you can't get your hands dirty in the nitty gritty of working and like truly training athletes, how are you supposed to do that?
Nice. Nice. Love it. Love it.